is to be made a lord. Now, Joe Fidgen uncovers the man behind the headlines.
There's a very widespread and entirely justified concern about the sheer scale that immigration has reached. If we go on as we are, we'll be adding 10 million to our population in 20 years' time.
Sir Andrew Green talking about the subject that's made him famous. This week he was appointed by the Prime Minister to the crossbenches of the House of Lords because of the contribution he's made to the debate about immigration as co-founder of Migration Watch UK. The other official reason is his 35-year career in the diplomatic service. But some of his acquaintances from that earlier life find it hard to accept his change of role. How did you react when you heard that Andrew Green had set up Migration Watch?
Well, I was stunned.
What explains why a former ambassador who won a lot of friends in the Middle East would spend his retirement trying to curb immigration? Is he, as Labour MP Peter Hain sees him,
carrying a Union Jack across the waves?
Absolutely not, says his friend Hajir Tamurian.
He's not what you would call a fire-breathing British patriot.
Do you think he's very misrepresented then by the media?
Hugely. I think that people on the left, if they met him, they would discover that he has a lot in common with them.
Who's right? No point searching online. You'll find nothing personal there. So we'll go back to the beginning. Andrew Green was born in 1941 in Ickenham in Middlesex. Very home counties. These days it's more built up, but when Andrew and his brothers were boys, it was a village surrounded by fields. According to his twin, Miles, it was a free and happy childhood. Both went to Cambridge, Andrew on a scholarship to read natural sciences and economics. After university, they joined the army. Andrew spent 3 years as an officer in the 1st Royal Green Jackets. Trained in jungle warfare, he was deployed to Malaya and Borneo. This is what a fellow soldier emailed us about him.
I recall he was so much cleverer than the rest of us and set up an amazing set of defensive traps around his platoon base. They fooled everyone.
Then it was to the Foreign Office for the Green Twins. Andrew glittered. He worked in Lebanon, Aden and Abu Dhabi as ambassador in Syria. There were stints in London as head of the counter-terrorist department in the late 80s and as Assistant Under-Secretary of State for the Middle East. By now, Sir Andrew, he rounded off his career as ambassador to Saudi Arabia, and it was during his time in Riyadh that William Morris met him.
There was this breed of British ambassadors to the Middle East who they actually really studied Arabic. They were remarkably respected in the Middle East, and they had a deep care for the Middle East.
He was virulently opposed to the Second Gulf War, a concern he shared with William Morris, who heads a charity working for conflict resolution, Next Century Foundation. The pair met in 2000 at a dinner hosted by the Kuwaiti ambassador to discuss what to do about growing tensions with Saddam Hussein.
He was a rational voice, actually, in a world in which we had a lot of hyperbole. I mean, you relied on people like Andrew Green, who were quite wise and thoughtful and measured, and they would say it like it was.
Sir Andrew joined forces with William Morris to try to avert the Iraq War and afterwards publicly chastised Tony Blair for what he regarded as a disastrous and culturally insensitive approach. No politician could expect an easy time from Ambassador Green, as Peter Hain found out when he was Blair's Middle East minister.
Andrew was rather frosty to begin with. He didn't take to Tony Blair's government, nor to Robin Cook, then Foreign Secretary, and my boss's ethical foreign policy. He was not an insensitive person or somebody who was a kind of Rottweiler of a sort of street UKIP caricature activist sense, but very, very firm in his views, quite unlike almost every other diplomat that I met in 12 years as a government minister.
I'm sure it's very frustrating to being an ambassador. You have to toe the line, and you can't allow yourself to think outside the box. And for a man of conscience, it must be very, very difficult.
Do you think he struggled with that?
I'm sure he struggled with that.
That struggle ended in 2000 when Sir Andrew retired from diplomatic service. The BBC got hold of his valedictory letter through a Freedom of Information request. He didn't pull his punches. "I have viewed with dismay," he wrote, "the spread of political correctness in recent years. Intellectual honesty is the foundation of our service. Political correctness, its antithesis." And he ended like this.
I conclude with a puff for the public service. My wife and I have been brought up to it and are deeply committed to it. The idea promoted by private sector consultants that you can drive your own career is simply absurd. The sense of purpose and the satisfaction of public service cannot be matched by the pursuit of a personal agenda, still less of a personal gain. So I leave the service well content, but I echo Sir Francis Walsingham. Would that I have served my God as I have served my Queen. It is to that which I shall turn my attention in such years as he may grant me.
And the church does take up a lot of his time. He holds Bible study groups at his home in Deddington in North Oxfordshire and helps out at the parish church.
It's not the most popular job to mow the churchyard, dodging all the graves with a mower, but he has been assiduous in taking on that job and keeping the churchyard tidy.
Canon Christopher Hall is a neighbour to Sir Andrew and his wife Jane.
He will express his views forcefully and has done in parish meetings, but always with great courtesy. When he congratulates me on a sermon, he will always say, "If I may say so."
Andrew and Jane are both very modest. They are not at all flashy. They are kind, and he and Jane love their garden. They live in a modest house in a country village in Oxfordshire. He drives a car which he calls my Gelotti, which is a 10-year-old family car, very small, not out of place on any council estate. He's of course well off because after all he's been a high-ranking diplomat. He could live much, much better.
This is Hajir Tamorian, a friend of Sir Andrew's.
We make jokes about faith when we go to funerals together. He sometimes believes that some funeral services are too elaborate and too much full of doctrine. I think he's a philosophical believer. I think though he's officially a member of the Church of England, he's very non-dogmatic. The essential thing is we mustn't be dogmatic and too sure of what our core beliefs are, because just in case we might be mistaken.
I think that description of him as somebody who's not dogmatic would come as a surprise to people who know him only from his more recent work on Migration Watch.
They only see a small public bit of him. They only see him being interviewed on migration. I wish they knew him as I know him.
My name is David Coleman. I'm the Professor Emeritus of Demography at Oxford University. I've known Andrew Green for about 13 years, I suppose, and we came into contact via a letter which I had published in the Times. She happened to read and find sympathetic, and he got in touch with me, and we agreed to meet after his retirement in Oxford and do something about what we regarded as a growing crisis in not just migration, but also in the public perception of migration and the way in which it was being discussed, or more importantly, not discussed.
The number of people moving to Britain was rising fast, and they couldn't see any political will to slow it down. So within 18 months of his retirement, Sir Andrew and David Coleman had set up Migration Watch UK, but not without giving it serious thought.
One of the things which struck me first of all was his moral sense, the fact that he was concerned about getting involved in this, concerned about what friends and family might think, concerned to make sure that what he said about it was charitable and as inoffensive as it's possible to make comments on migration.
Migration Watch describes itself as a non-political think tank. Some commentators call it a pressure group. The move came as no surprise to Peter Hain, who knew Sir Andrew through the Foreign Office.
This was rather the Andrew Green in a new role that was quite consistent and flowed logically from the person that I met as an ambassador. That view of Britain from a traditionalist, old-fashioned stance fits exactly with his stance on Migration Watch.
But William Morris, who teamed up with Sir Andrew to try to stop the Iraq War, was astonished.
The guy was everything Arab, everything Middle Eastern, everything to do with the Middle East he cared about. He was working hell for leather to support minorities in the Middle East. He really was passionate about the Arab world. And then out he comes with this. To me, it was like something from left field. It just didn't seem to make sense.
There's not necessarily a contradiction, is there, between the commitment and the caring that you've talked about for the Middle East and a position that says Britain can't cope with high levels of immigration?
No, but there is this difficulty that you become a kind of standard bearer for the extreme right. And he's really very outspoken on immigration matters, and I find it bothering.
Sir Andrew's friends insist he absolutely didn't want that. But what was it then that so worried him about mass immigration that he was prepared to take the risk? David Coleman is his right-hand man at Migration Watch. Is it about jobs and housing or cultural values?
The ethnic and cultural side seems to me to be very important, but it's certainly been very much less to the fore in comments that he's made and everything that he's done.
What would be the ultimate goal of Migration Watch? What do you want to achieve, the two of you?
That's a very good question. I suppose it's to bring the volume of migration down to a level with which the British people will feel satisfied and where it can cease to be a troublesome issue of public concern.
So you don't want to close the borders?
No, of course not. That would be an actual lunacy.
David Coleman says he and Sir Andrew always knew they'd attract brickbats by talking about immigration.
He's been subject to so much flack, so many really awful insults, that remaining calm and unflappable while still sticking to his guns and being, as it were, constant under fire is a clear requirement.
What's the worst that you and he have been called?
Certainly racist, probably fascist, all kinds of general unkind remarks.
What does his friend Hajir Tamourian, a Kurd originally from Iran, make of that?
He's got many, many friends in the Arab world, and among his personal friends are people from all races in Britain who have settled here. So he's the furthest you could imagine from being a racist.
Some people would hear in that a contradiction between a man who has many friends who are not British and who have moved to Britain, living here, and yet he is involved with an organisation which speaks against immigration.
He is very concerned that all of our immigrants should settle in here and to be happy. But he agrees with me and many others that if you are to achieve that, if you are to prevent the rise of ghettos and separation, you've got to have immigration on a scale that is manageable.
Sir Andrew is an Arabist, pro-Palestinian. He campaigned against the invasion of Iraq. Not what you might expect from someone perceived as right-wing. He's disliked by many on the left, but not by all. Labour MP Peter Hain.
I got to quite like him as an individual and to admire his professionalism and his skill, and certainly that was very evident. So you can disagree with Andrew Green, as I did when I was a minister and as I do now, whilst nevertheless admiring his professionalism and his skills.
Now that he's had 14 years having a go at the establishment, how is he likely to fit in when he takes up his oh-so-establishment seat in the House of Lords? His co-founder at Migration Watch, David Coleman, thinks he'll relish the opportunity to do what he does best, stir things up.
I think he might enjoy some mischief. I imagine that he would enjoy seeing, as he can quite closely and clearly, all kinds of nonsense. I guess a certain amount of nonsense is taught in the House of Lords, if I can say so without being sent to the Tower, and he will puncture it.
Profile was presented by Joe Fidgen and produced by Laura Gray.